Muy buenos días a todos. En verdad me da muchísimo gusto estarlos viendo por este medio. Y quisiera, para iniciar bien nuestro día, quisiera que nos pusiéramos todos ante la presencia de Dios. Para ello, le voy a pedir a la doctora Berta Fortul de la Salle, México, nos haga el favor de hacer la oración. Adelante, doctora Berta.
En el nombre del Padre, del Hijo, del Espíritu Santo. Amén. Acordémonos que estamos en la presencia de Dios.
Adorémosle.
Los invito a todos juntos a hacer la oración en voz alta. Señor, haz que en mi corazón se difunda un gran amor por mi profesión. Ilumina mi sendero con la ciencia, sabiduría, técnica e innovación en mi investigación para apoyar acertadamente la construcción de un mundo más justo. Amén. Amén. Viva Jesús en nuestros corazones.
Por siempre.
En nombre del Padre, del Hijo, del Espíritu Santo. Amén.
Amén.
Bueno, ahora sí, sin más, quisiera el día de hoy presentarles al doctor Eduardo Gómez Ramírez de Universidad La Salle, México, quien será en esta sesión nuestro moderador. Doctor Eduardo, sea muy bienvenido y muchas gracias por acompañarnos, doctor. Cedo la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Anabel. Bueno, buenos días formalmente, estimadas autoridades, maestros, investigadores que nos acompañan en nuestro segundo día del tercer encuentro de investigadores lasallistas. Para empezar, me gustaría retomar algunas reflexiones del día de ayer del hermano Gustavo, que nos compartió un mensaje pues, muy inspirador para nosotros. Él hablaba de este tema y utilizó una palabra que bueno, yo no había escuchado, que es mistadógico, ¿no? Y él decía que un buscador, y bueno, se refería a un investigador, está decidido a buscar respuestas, a buscar soluciones a las necesidades, y por lo tanto esta tarea no terminaba con los simples resultados, sino que estábamos llamados a comunicar esta revelación de ese misterio, ¿no? Y decía, toda investigación tiene un enorme potencial para develar un misterio más grande, el misterio de la creación y de la criatura. Hay paradojas que deben desentrañarse, como la presente crisis de salud que ha evidenciado la paradoja que es la criatura humana, la pequeñez y la grandeza, la debilidad y la humanidad. Bueno, con este mensaje iniciamos nuestra sesión y hoy vamos a tener dos presentaciones. En un primer momento vamos a compartirles el mensaje del doctor Raymond Girard. Él es vicerrector de investigación de la Universidad de Salle, Filipinas. Por cuestiones de horario, porque a veces no nos imaginamos cuál es el horario en otra parte del mundo, en Filipinas son 13 horas más. Entonces esto complicaba que pudiera estar en vivo y por esta razón nos mandó su presentación. Posteriormente, el hermano visitador de las Antillas México Sur, el hermano Pedro Álvarez Arenas, nos va a dar una plática y estamos muy contentos porque pues la agenda del hermano es un poco complicada y más en estos tiempos y se dio un espacio para estar con nosotros. Él nos va a compartir su mensaje sobre la importancia de la investigación en el lasallismo, que es un tema que hemos estado insistiendo para que no nos olvidemos el compromiso que tenemos como investigadores lasallistas, ¿no? Y después, perdón. Después de un breve receso, como el día de ayer, vamos a seguir con dos conversatorios. El primero será en el área de salud, para continuar después con el desarrollo humano y social. Y culminaremos al final de nuestro día con la dinámica grupal que el hermano Gustavo nos comentaba, ¿no? Él decía, la labor del investigador, entre muchas otras cualidades, ejecuta el arte de hacer preguntas inteligentes, profundas y sagaces, que contribuyan para hacer conexiones mentales y resolver problemas espinosos. Bueno, esperamos que este espacio pueda ser un momento de reflexión entre todos los que están participando en el encuentro. Y como lo hemos reiterado en varias ocasiones, el que podamos lograr este objetivo será posible solo si todos participamos de manera activa y comprometida. Entendemos que esta parte virtual pues tiene algunas limitaciones, pero el día de ayer definitivamente todos mostraron que podemos sobrellevarlas sin ningún problema. Bueno, sin más preámbulos, me voy a permitir introducir un breve currículum para que conozcamos quién es el doctor Raymond Girard. Él, como les había comentado, es el vicerrector de investigación de la Universidad de La Salle en Manila, Filipinas. Él es profesor de Ingeniería Química, él es miembro de la universidad actualmente, es docente de la Academia Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología de Filipinas. Su principal interés de investigación es el desarrollo de modelos matemáticos para sistemas industriales sostenibles. Él es de los investigadores lasallistas que más publicaciones tiene hasta el momento 380, y tiene un índice H de 43 en la base de datos Scopus. Y bueno, no solamente los principales investigadores lasallistas, sino a nivel mundial, en las áreas de integración de procesos, ingeniería de sistemas de procesos. Él recibió su licenciatura y maestría en ingeniería química y su doctorado en ingeniería mecánica de la Universidad de La Salle. Es el editor en jefe de Process Integration and Optimization for Sustainability. Es el editor de temas de producción y consumo sustentables del Sevier, editor asociado en The Cleaner Engineering and Technology y miembro del Consejo Editorial de Tecnologías Limpias y Política Medioambiental de Springer en la sección de Nature. Es autor de libros, Enfoques de Integración de Procesos para la Planificación de Redes de Gestión de Carbono, publicado por CRPRES, y Modelos de Entrada-Salida para Sistemas Industriales Sostenibles, de Springer, y es editor de varios libros. Recientemente ha publicado el diseño y optimización de procesos sostenibles en Wiley y procesos y estrategias de diseño para sistemas de conversión de biomasa en World Scientific. Ha recibido múltiples premios científicos de organizaciones gubernamentales y profesionales en Filipinas. Y bueno, como les comenté al principio, por cuestiones de la gran diferencia de horario que existe, nos preparó su exposición. Y bueno, debido a que no va a ser, digamos, síncrona la participación del doctor Raymond, de todos modos, si ustedes nos mandan sus preguntas como si fuera presencial, nosotros las vamos a recopilar y se las vamos a enviar para que él nos conteste vía correo o en un video. ¿Sí? Entonces, sí, por favor, iniciamos con la presentación del doctor Raymond Girard.
Good morning, colleagues. It's my pleasure to give a talk this morning on COVID-19 research at De La Salle University in Manila, Philippines. I'm sorry I'm not personally to Mexico. Of course, current conditions make international travel extremely difficult, and many academic and scientific events have been done remotely for the past several months. So I'm glad that I do have this opportunity, and I'll be giving a talk this morning, which is divided into 4 parts. First, I'll give an overview of COVID-19 and my university's response to this crisis. And then I'll speak specifically about a project that deals with the shortage of future COVID-19 drugs. And I'm speaking both of antivirals and vaccines, which are under development by various pharmaceutical firms throughout the world. A small ad hoc research team in our university developed a computer model to assist in decision support for the optimal allocation of such drugs, because we anticipate that the supply may not be able to meet the demands because of the scale of the pandemic. And finally, I'll talk about the implications and conclusions. So first, on to the overview of the pandemic. Let me say first that to introduce our university, De La Salle University is the flagship Lasallian institution in the Philippines. We were founded in 1911, initially as De La Salle College, and in 1975 we were granted university status. Coincidentally, this was the same year that we started admitting female students, and now the population has a fairly good gender balance, close to 50% female for both student and the faculty members. Now, the change of status to university, which happened 45 years ago, also planted the seeds towards a transition to be a teaching and research institution, and it took more than one generation for this shift to occur through investment, particularly in human resources and upgrading of faculty skills through graduate education. And we have thus, in the past decade, we've enjoyed quite a lot of research success. In particular, 600% research growth from 2010 to 2019. And we're competitive with the largest public universities in the Philippines in terms of output, and we've recently gained recognition among the world's research universities, particularly in subject areas like physical sciences, social sciences, and engineering and technology. We do not have a strong body of work in the health and medical sciences, though, which means that when the pandemic came along, we were not in a position to directly contribute to the clinical aspects or clinical research aspects that the problem demanded. Now, the pandemic has escalated rapidly, and to date, more than 10 million people have been infected. Sadly, more than 500,000 people have died of the disease. Distributed throughout the world, I know that Latin America has been particularly hard hit in recent months. Europe came along much earlier, and as you can see from this screenshot of the dashboard of the World Health Organization, the disease essentially is present in all parts of the world, and some countries have had success in managing or suppressing the outbreak of the disease, but in many other places it has spread and escalated. And of course, it remains to be seen how this pandemic will play out in the coming months or even in the coming year. In response to the pandemic, one of the first things we did back in March of this year was to launch on our website a COVID-19 research portal. This portal was intended initially as a public face, a unified public face of all the work being done on COVID-19 within the university, but it also serves as a staging area for different faculty members and research groups to find out what is being done in other parts of the university, and thus provides some way for teams to form, because the university is large enough that not everybody knows what everyone else is doing. So that's one of the useful side effects of having this research portal. One of the other adjustments that we've done is, as with universities throughout the world, we've shifted to research dissemination via online events rather than physical travel. This is true both for online events that we're hosting and online events such as yours, which our faculty members attend virtually. We've also encouraged experts among our faculty members to provide service via public engagement, and our colleagues, for instance, have given advice to government agencies based on their specific areas of expertise. They've engage the public through media and through social media on various COVID-19 issues, both health issues and issues relating to the lockdown, which has various political, social, and economic dimensions. And to date, we've contributed about 13% of the Philippines' research output on COVID. And I mentioned previously that the work we're doing is not so much in clinical or health studies, but we've looked at areas such as post-pandemic economic recovery, because the lockdowns that we've had to impose in the Philippines, as in many parts of the world, is causing terrible economic damage, loss of livelihood, a loss of jobs for many people. So there will be a need to eventually exit from the lockdowns and rebuild the economy, and we have a very strong track record in economics, which we can use to help policymakers in the Philippines come up with rational plans for rebuilding the economy. Another subject area of interest is how to deliver flexible and online education. And this is really a mix both of understanding the technology and understanding the human aspect and psychological aspect of delivering education remotely. And we do have strength in both of these areas. We also have strength in the engineering and business aspect of health systems management, because hospitals, for example, are essentially they're organizations that provide a specific service, and in addition to the clinical service that takes place at the front lines, they need to be managed in such a way that limited resources can be used to deal with the surge in the number of patients. So we do have colleagues working on this aspect of health resources. One very important area as well is mental health and well-being, which are critical issues because we have people who deal with the anxiety of facing the disease. The anxiety could arise from taking care of sick relatives or from the economic losses that may occur. So it's important to understand and manage mental health during the course of the pandemic. And finally, we have plenty of work being done on transportation systems and logistics, using modern technology to ensure the steady flow of goods which you need to deliver to citizens. For example, food supplies, medicine, these need to be delivered under lockdown or partial lockdown conditions. So with the use of technology, we can optimize the delivery of these goods. This is a screenshot of our COVID-19 research portal. On the screen, you can also see the URL, and I would invite you to visit this portal, which we update every Wednesday. And on screen, you can see an example of some of the works being done. To the left is work done by one of our top psychologists on anxiety in the face of the pandemic. On the extreme right is some work done by our philosophy faculty members, documenting the role of the church in helping communities cope with the COVID-19 crisis. And in the center is the work which I'll be discussing later in this talk, done by an ad hoc research group, which is how to distribute drugs that are in limited supply to meet the demands of various patients with different levels of disease severity. During this pandemic, we've also continued collaboration with research groups from different universities. This is one work which is especially relevant. One of our top economists, Dr. Yu, who did post-disaster recovery work for her PhD thesis earlier in the past decade, we decided that we needed to revamp this work and fit it to the conditions of the modern pandemic crisis. And we started work with colleagues from Heriot-Watt University and the University of Nottingham, which are both UK universities that have satellite campuses in Malaysia. And through our contacts there, we have a project ongoing which looks at the cases of both Malaysia and the Philippines, and we look specifically at how to optimize the resources of the government to rebuild parts of the economy, and we look specifically at agro-industrial supply chains which are needed for food supply in all countries. And we think that by using rigorous tools from economic science, we can actually help both countries develop stronger, more rational, and more effective policies to restart their economies. And these principles may well apply to other countries outside of these two Asian nations as well. So that's a sampling of some of the work that's being done at our university. And I'll proceed to a discussion of something more specific in the next section of my talk. In this second part of my talk, I'll discuss a problem which we expect to occur in the coming months, which is the shortage of future COVID-19 drugs. The disease has threatened to overwhelm healthcare capacity in many countries. It has done so in places like Italy, for example, earlier this year, and may well do so in other countries if not properly managed. What is being done on a large scale in various universities and pharmaceutical firms throughout the world is that there is a concerted effort to develop vaccines and antivirals for the disease. Unfortunately, on average, it takes about a decade to go from initial discovery of a potential drug towards successful release in the market. So that's a 10-year lag, and what we're doing in this global emergency is to try to compress what is normally a one-decade research and development process into a more manageable one-year process. And this is difficult because none of the vaccines have yet reached commercial stage. There is hope that by the end of 2020 or by early 2021, some of these vaccines will be approved for commercial use. Likewise for antivirals. Fortunately, there is one stopgap measure which has worked to some extent, which is to repurpose commercially available drugs that were originally developed for the treatment of other diseases. And because these drugs are already in the market, they can be deployed much more rapidly than drugs that are being developed from fresh or new research and development findings. Examples of two drugs which have recently been shown to be at least partially effective for COVID-19 are remdesivir and dexamethasone, again previously existing, but now it turns out that they can be used for treating severe COVID-19 cases. So this repurposing means that the drugs essentially can already be accessed by sick patients. The problem, which my colleagues and I wrote about in an article several months ago, is that drug discovery and drug production are two different steps. Drug discovery is scientific, and it essentially involves finding out whether a particular chemical or pharmaceutical product is effective and safe for treatment of a disease. Drug manufacture is an engineering and business problem, and the issue there is, can the drug be made in sufficient quantities and delivered to where it's needed? And this is not a scientific problem, it's really a business problem. There are potential complications. For instance, countries may opt to corner significant portions of the available drugs in the market. This can happen, for instance, in countries which manufacture the drugs, and they could opt to reduce the exports for internal use of the drugs for their own citizens. So these kinds of political barriers to equitable distribution of the drugs throughout the world is a serious threat, even after the drugs themselves have been proven to be effective. So we wrote an article about this. We were interviewed by a newspaper in the Philippines about what can be done to secure adequate supplies of these drugs in the future. This really is an issue which would apply in Mexico or in any other country which would have COVID-19 patients. What happened in March was, as we became aware of this potential issue in the future, and as everyone was initially in shock from being locked down at home, going through the internet and looking at the government statistics and looking at the health statistics on number of hospital beds available in their cities or in their respective countries or respective cities and towns, we decided, a small group of faculty members decided to form an ad hoc research team, and I was one of these 12 that I speak of. We thought essentially that it would be pointless to just be watching the statistics and not do anything about it. So we decided to make ourselves useful and try to find some purpose from all of this data gathering. And we formed a group, and our intent was to use the statistics and the projections in a fast-track effort to come up with a computer model which, in anticipation of a future drug shortage, would help doctors and hospital administrators prioritize the allocation of these drugs to patients with various levels of disease severity. And this is the work which I'll be discussing in the next part of my talk. So for the third part of my talk, I'll go into some detail about the computer model that we developed for optimal drug allocation. This work has been published recently in the journal Clean Technologies and Environmental Policy. The hyperlink on this slide actually brings you to that article, which is available for free. Major publishers nowadays are making COVID-19 papers available for free to the public. So this work, if you're interested, you can actually read the details through a PDF copy of your own. So at the bottom of the slide, you can see the names of the 11 co-authors that I worked with in developing this work, which had broad aspects ranging from the data collection to the actual development of the program and running the simulations, and then the interpretation of the results from the perspective of a real-life decision maker, say medical doctors or medical administrators in hospitals. So the reason for the large team is that we had to look at the different aspects and implications of this work. I'll try to avoid too much of the mathematical details, which are more meant for a specialist audience. But I will have to say that the tool we used is something known as mathematical programming, also known as operations research or systems engineering. This is a tool which was developed originally in the 1940s to optimize military logistics. It did not take too long for the military applications to then be adopted for use in industry to improve profitability and efficiency in areas such as supply chain management and engineering design. Nowadays, this is also being used for artificial intelligence and machine learning and various other applications. So we do have strong expertise. Two of my colleagues have very strong expertise with extensive body of work in different applications of mathematical programming, but not in drug allocation until a few months ago. Now, this is the general template for mathematical programming. I won't discuss the technical aspects. What we do essentially, the art of mathematical programming, is to take a real-world problem and to come up with a reasonably accurate mathematical representation of reality. This process can never be done to 100% fidelity. There's always some loss of resolution, and we try to simplify what is occurring in the real world so that we have a program which is eventually manageable when it comes to trying to simulate and compute the solutions. If you go overboard and try to come up with a model which is too high resolution or high fidelity, you may run the risk of not being able to solve the model that you come up with. So it's essential to balance fidelity and computability. And of course, my two colleagues have had extensive experience in doing this. And we applied it to the problem of drug allocation with some simplifying assumptions. First, we assume that there's a user input of antiviral quantity in terms of treatment courses available. Now, a treatment course is essentially the daily dosage multiplied by the number of days that a patient needs to be taking the medication. So a given quantity of drug would then be sufficient for one treatment course, and this is the basic unit of treatment. And this applies to multiple drugs which may be available in the market. At the same time, we assume that the COVID-19 case statistics are classified to different severity levels, and that different levels of severity require different levels of care. Some patients may just need to stay home and have bed rest. Some patients may require hospitalization, and a subset of those patients in hospital may require intensive care. So these are different levels of treatment. And we identify what's known as appropriate care, which would have an associated fatality rate very low, for instance, among patients that require bed rest, and significantly higher among those in hospital, especially in intensive care. This is known as case fatality rate. It's the probability that a patient at a given level of severity will die of the disease. Now, we also know that in a situation where hospital resources are strained, they may be forced to turn away patients, and those patients do not get what is an appropriate level of care. And what happens to such patients is that the fatality rates would be much higher than if they were to get the correct level of treatment. So, for instance, if you had a severe case with a patient requiring intensive care, but there's no space in a hospital to give this patient that level of care, the chances of the patient passing away from the disease rises to a much higher level. Now, the other information that needs to be put into the model would be disease incidence rates in a particular region or a particular city, which is the demand for healthcare. And likewise, within the same geographic region, the healthcare resources available, which would include hospitals, hospital beds, and of course the healthcare workers that are needed to run those hospitals, nurses and doctors that provide that care. So on the one hand, you have the demand for treatment. On the other hand, you have the supply available to treat those cases of COVID-19. And these are monitored on a day-to-day basis in many countries and cities throughout the world. And finally, the model needs as a data input the effectiveness of the antiviral medication. The assumption that we make is that the effect of the medication is it reduces the severity level of the patient. So, for instance, if a patient that requires intensive care in a hospital is given a future antiviral, there's a probability that the patient will be transferred to a much lower level of severity. So what that means is, instead of requiring intensive care in a hospital, the same patient with the drug may be able to survive the disease with just regular hospital care. And likewise, someone who would need hospitalization perhaps can just get through the disease with bed rest at home, given the proper medication. Now, this doesn't necessarily occur 100% of the time, but we assume that through tests of the antivirals, there's a percentage probability of being able to transfer the patients to lower severity levels. So these are the user-defined inputs that go into the model. The model that we created essentially takes all of this information, processes it, and gives back to the user the following information. The model provides advice on which antivirals should be given to which patient categories not to specific patients, but to patient categories based on severity levels. And also the model then says that these patients will probably need reduced levels of appropriate care because the severity has been reduced by use of the medication. So these are what the model communicates to the end user. This is the actual model itself in symbolic form, which I will not discuss, but the graphic that we have on the right-hand side of the screen provides a better, simpler explanation without going into the specialist details. If we were to assume that COVID-19 cases fall into 3 severity level categories requiring different resources, as you would see here: ICU beds, regular hospital beds, and home rest. By administering the medication, it is possible to transfer patients from higher levels of severity to much lower levels of severity. And this can be useful because it can relieve stress on the hospital resources. For instance, typically you'd have much fewer ICU beds in a regular hospital than you would the normal beds. So if you can transfer patients to lower severity levels, you can certainly relieve stress on the hospitals and reduce patient fatalities. This, of course, is the most important outcome. So what I'll do next is show a hypothetical case study which is meant to illustrate what the model can do. At the time that we did this work, there were no known drugs that were effective and safe for treatment of COVID-19. So we made some assumptions about fictitious drugs with different levels of efficacy. What can happen in the future is, as data on new drugs become available, these can be put into the same model, but we're using different numbers or numerical values, and you could come up with new solutions. So here's the assumption that we made in our demonstration case study with a hypothetical population of 1,000 COVID-19 patients at different levels of severity, 800 low-risk patients, or those requiring just home rest, 150 at the intermediate level, and 50 critical cases that require intensive care. So out of these 1,000 patients, we assume that there are 2 pharmaceutical products available, as shown in the second table on this slide. And when administered, the drugs have a certain probability of transferring patients to lower levels of severity. And if we look at the extreme bottom right-hand corner of this slide for antiviral B, what it does is for every patient who requires critical care, 60% probability, there's a 60% chance that this patient will be reclassified into a moderate level of severity by administering antiviral B. And there's a 40% chance that the drug will not reduce the severity level. And what that means is if you have 10 cases that initially require critical care, 6 of those cases would be reclassified to moderate care, and only 4 would be left in intensive care if you were to use antiviral B. And this is how we assume the drugs to work. Now, in this slide, we show the resource requirements, which I've explained previously. We assume that there are no limits to home rest resources. We do assume that there are just 100 regular hospital beds and 20 intensive care beds within the hospital, which you would note is insufficient to meet the demands of patients that require hospitalization. And at the bottom of the screen, we have the mortality rates or fatality rates of patients at the different severity levels. And you would note, for example, that For patients requiring critical care, if they don't get intensive care unit level of treatment, there's close to 100% chance of fatality. If they do get the adequate care through ICU, then the odds go down dramatically to 50% survival. Likewise, for moderate cases with, we assume 20% mortality initially without adequate care, but this drops down to 5% mortality if there is adequate care. And what we did with our model is we looked at 3 different scenarios. The baseline scenario, what we did with our model is we looked at 3 different scenarios. The baseline scenario, which has no antiviral available, results in 55 fatalities out of the 1,000 patients initially. And a large part of the problem is that there are more patients than there are hospital beds. As you can see, a total of 200 requiring hospital care versus only 120 beds available in the hospital. So actually 80 out of the 200 patients do not get the appropriate level of care. And this is what accounts for the high fatality rate, which is 5.5% of the sick population passing away from COVID-19. Now we take a look at the second scenario, which assumes that we have those 2 antivirals, which we just label as A and B, and we assume that medical doctors just use the 2 drugs interchangeably. And what we can see is because the drugs both have similar effects of reducing the severity levels, both drugs are able to reduce the level of disease severity in the sick patients. So the good news now is in this scenario, there are enough hospital beds for everybody. So all the patients that are sick and are given the drugs now get the appropriate level of care. And as a result, fatalities out of the 1,000 cases that we have 12 fatalities, which is dropped to 1.2% fatality rate across the sick population. And this is a 78% reduction from the initial case if there was no medication available. Now, 12 fatalities is still a bad thing, but what we've done is we've saved 43 lives hypothetically in the process by using these 2 medications. Now, we assume in this case, let me repeat, that the drugs are being used interchangeably as they become available to the doctors. Can we do better than this? And this is where we show that by using a computer program, rather than having the doctors just randomly interchangeably use the 2 drugs, by having specific rules on how to use these drugs that are computed through a mathematical model, then we can further save an additional 3 lives. So you would note that in the previous scenario, there were 12 fatalities. This is the optimized drug allocation, which simply says that we use antiviral A for all of the critical cases and antiviral B for all the moderate cases, which still has the effect of ensuring that all sick patients are able to receive adequate levels of care. But by optimizing the allocation of the drugs that are available, instead of having 12 fatalities out of 1,000 sick patients, now we have only 9. So we've saved an additional 3 lives, and this represents an 83% reduction from the original fatality count, which we expected 55 fatalities without any medication at all. So we've done better, slightly better, by having a computer provide advice to the medical professionals as to how to use the drugs. This is the summary of the results, and you can compare the 3 different scenarios in terms of how effective they are in reducing fatalities and managing health care for the hypothetical 1,000 COVID-19 patients. We've also looked at using the model with Philippine, or actually data from Manila, based on forecasts that were available back in April. We don't have time this morning to go into the details, but you can download the full paper as I showed earlier, and you can look at some of the figures that we've been able to generate for a much larger data set involving thousands of patients based on government projections in the Philippines. And I'll conclude this part of the talk by discussing the implications of why it's essential that computer programs be used for decision support. And in April, I read an article written by medical doctors in Italy, and they commented that one of the reasons for the high fatality rates that they encountered was that the medical doctors were essentially using a patient-centric view, and rightly so, that any medical doctor will essentially try to make the best decisions for his or her patients. And normally what happens is the doctors, the frontline personnel, are making decisions on a local level, seeing only a small number of patients at a time, those that are directly under their care. And what happens is, because they have no view of the community level perspective, this kind of decision making can result in a global misallocation of limited healthcare resources. And this is actually a comment made by medical practitioners in Italy at the time, that had there been a community level perspective on how to allocate hospital beds, which were running in short supply, then more lives could have been saved. And this is where a computer program fed with the right data can be used to coordinate the decisions by frontline medical personnel, not necessarily to replace their expertise, but to supplement their expertise by having a global view of the problem, or system level view. And what happens, we've demonstrated, at least with a hypothetical case study, that you can reduce mortality rate or fatality rate quite significantly by having this kind of decision support. Let me now say some final words about research and our role as researchers in responding to the global COVID-19 crisis. The pandemic is a global problem with multiple dimensions covering health, economic, sociological, psychological, and various other dimensions. And as such, it presents what you would call a wicked problem, which is so complex that it presents a puzzle to decision makers, such as politicians, who have to make difficult choices on behalf of their constituents. For example, the trick of balancing, on the one hand, there is a need to suppress the spread of the virus through lockdowns and community quarantines. And on the other hand, there is a need to ensure that the economy keeps running, because people still need goods to survive and people need jobs. And to a large extent, these are contradictory goals that need to be balanced, and decision makers in government are in a tough place trying to come up with policies that will balance these two issues. Because whatever happens, there will be critics on both sides saying that they could have done better. And now I think the role of the global research community is to provide much needed knowledge support to these decision makers, because unfortunately COVID-19 is a new enemy, and we've had to learn so much about it in just the span of a few months. And of course, government response is improving gradually as we understand more about the disease, but it is essential that more scientifically rigorous knowledge is brought to bear on the problem and transferred from academia to government and industry, so that better decisions can be made in coping with this crisis. And this is an ongoing war which has to be fought. In academia, our role is to provide this knowledge as as our contribution to the world. So finally, I just want to thank the 11 co-authors of the work I presented earlier today. Thanks again for coming up with all of the components of the project in such a short span of time and under difficult and stressful circumstances. And finally, I thank you all for your attention. I'll be happy to take questions and comments remotely. Due to the time difference, I'm unable to join you live this morning, but these are my contact details. You can send me an email for any questions or comments, and I'll be happy to respond as promptly as the time difference allows. Thank you once again, and I wish everyone a safe passage through this pandemic.
Bueno, recopilando algunos comentarios que nos hicieron llegar en el chat. En cuanto tengamos integrada la presentación, bueno, recuerden que todo el evento está siendo grabado. Ahí pueden hacer una primera consulta y el archivo de la presentación, dependiendo del tamaño, vamos a ver dónde lo colocamos y posteriormente les mandaremos la información. Bueno, solamente algunos comentarios generales. Creo que la presentación es interesante en el sentido de conocer una de las universidades más antiguas del modelo de lasallista. Como vieron, fue fundada en 1911. Esta institución también nos debe de servir de ejemplo porque empezó con este enfoque de una universidad de investigación con esa propuesta alrededor de los 70s. Actualmente es una de las universidades que más publicaciones tiene. No solamente hablando desde el punto de vista cuantitativo, tienen un modelo que también consideramos, o sea, no solamente una universidad de investigación, sino también una universidad emprendedora, comprometida pues con su región. Como ya vieron en términos de los rankings, es una de las instituciones mejor posicionadas de la región y valdría la pena que nos acercáramos, que entremos al sitio, que bueno, nos ofrecieron también el sitio del COVID, donde tienen ahí publicaciones y varias de las actividades que están realizando, y creo que hay buenas prácticas que podemos tomar de ellos. Inclusive en un futuro podríamos pensar en invitar algunos de los actores. Nosotros visitamos la Salle Manile, conocimos al vicerrector anterior, y bueno, es interesante conocer cómo una universidad lasallista en el futuro, si nosotros tomamos ahorita este modelo de darle a la investigación como función sustantiva un mayor valor en nuestras instituciones. Bueno, no sé si quieran hacer algún comentario.
Sí, doctor, yo quisiera comentar algo, doctor Gómez.
Adelante, por favor.
A mí me parece importante, bueno, me presento, soy el doctor Luis Armando Gervasio, trabajo en la Facultad Mexicana de Medicina, y algo que se mencionó incluso en la presentación, y es parte de un proyecto que yo tengo, la simulación clínica, doctor. Ahora que no tenemos muchos espacios en los libros y que los estudiantes puedan hacer sus, digamos, mucha gente lo conoce así como prácticas clínicas, el escenario o los escenarios de la simulación, me parece que ahorita se van a tener que profundizar, se van a tener que también adentrar todas las universidades en este tipo de prácticas, ya que pues, como ustedes lo saben, en un futuro muchos hospitales todavía no podemos abrirnos a que los estudiantes, los internos, los médicos residentes trabajen o tengan este tema de la práctica clínica con los pacientes. Entonces, seguramente los simuladores van a tener que desarrollarse mucho más usted lo sabe, en otras áreas como la aviación, la ingeniería, esto está muy avanzado y en la medicina pues no tendrá que ser una excepción, ¿no?
Así es, así es, así es. Obviamente el tema del confinamiento pues requiere que estas herramientas de simulación se desarrollen todavía más, aunque bueno, sigue habiendo una discusión de qué tanto se acercan a la realidad, pero bueno, ahorita es lo que hay y obviamente hay que desarrollarlas lo más posible, ¿no? También el tema de la simulación es un proyecto multidisciplinario donde es importante que varias áreas trabajen en equipo, en grupo, de manera sinérgica y que puedan inclusive llegar a un nivel transdisciplinario, ¿no? Porque obviamente hay que desarrollar tanto conceptos comunes, o sea, cosas que desde una sola disciplina no se pueden trabajar, ¿sí? Bueno, ¿algún otro comentario? Un último comentario para pasar a nuestra siguiente presentación. Bueno, de todos modos, si no existiera un comentario, nos lo pueden hacer llegar por correo si tienen alguna inquietud posterior. Nosotros con mucho gusto vía correo se lo mandaremos al doctor Raymond, ¿no? Insisto, creo que hay muchas cosas que podemos ver de otras instituciones lasallistas que ya tienen un camino con más años, con más experiencia. No necesariamente es que tengamos que tener el mismo camino, pero podemos platicar con ellos y al menos la experiencia de qué cosas no volverían a hacer o qué cosas sugerirían para las instituciones, independientemente de la evolución que tengan. Creo que esta retroalimentación es muy importante.